Next up, podcast listeners, should 6-year-olds learn trans indoctrination? Probably not. Of course they shouldn't. Of course they should not. So Bill Maher defends the Florida bill. I think it's House Bill 1557. And it's kind of shocking that Bill Maher would actually come out against this type of bill. But thankfully, there is a liberal out there somewhere who thinks this is a really bad idea. Hopefully more liberals across the country will, have an awakening and realize how sick this is. House Bill 1557 is a parental rights bill for public education. And we'll go more into this bill briefly. We've talked about it, I think in the past a little bit. But first up, here's Bill Maher setting this up about House Bill 1557 in Florida. Pretty interesting series of clips. Here's the first.
Somebody asked this. Is Florida's Don't Say Gay bill designed to trap Democrats into saying they support teaching young children about sexuality? Is the question, but we can broaden that to anything about that. I mean, I was reading about it today. If people don't know, this is something DeSantis is about to sign. Yeah. And I guess it's a reaction to Republicans who feel that there's too much talk in lower grades. I think they're talking about kindergarten to third grade. So We're talking about very young kids who, as always with this stuff, there's not like there's no kernel of truth in that maybe kids that young shouldn't be thinking about sex at all. I don't think it's...
Talk about a revelation, right? Can you imagine the left just maybe 6 months ago or yesterday ever having this conversation? Namely, maybe kids in, pre-K, K, first, second, and third grades shouldn't really be educated about or talking about sex at all in the classroom. You think? How did we even get here? So here's Bill Maher again. I love how he says he watched CNN. Cracks me up. I mean, he's just an endless lefter. But anyway, here's the next clip.
What part of the bill? It says the measure this is from CNN, would require districts to adopt procedures for notifying a student's parent if there is a change in the student's services or monitoring related to the student's mental, emotional, physical health or well-being. Okay, then it says something LGBTQ advocates argue could lead to some students being outed to their parents. That phrase struck me as odd. Like, outed to parents? Like, shouldn't parents know everything anyway? The concept of...
Shouldn't parents know everything anyway? And podcast listeners, keep in mind what we're talking about here. House Bill 1557 in Florida does nothing more than say pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade. You're outing your child. The teacher doesn't want to have a conversation with the parent about what the hell would a teacher have a conversation about a parent about sex and their children anyway? I mean, the only exception to this that I can possibly imagine is if the kid were bringing inappropriate, things to the classroom, which means that they're probably seeing this or hearing this back home. Instead, the kid would be bringing inappropriate things from the classroom itself back home to the parents. And so the idea that the left would be upset that any parent would want to know what is happening in the classroom, number one, and number two, that under no circumstance should any sexual course be taught or discussed in a classroom of kindergarten, first and second, third grade. It's just kind of common sense. And even Bill Maher is like, I watch CNN and, even CNN is talking about this bill. And of course, CNN's talking about this bill because they hate Governor DeSantis, who signed the bill into law. And CNN, of course, torched Governor DeSantis because even CNN thinks it's okay for kids to be taught these things in kindergarten, first and second and third grade, and also pre-K. And just to set this up even further, because we have another clip on this, left-leaning comedian, this is in the Daily Wire, Bill Maher defended the Florida bill that critics have unfairly labeled Don't Say Gay bill, arguing that the overtime portion of Friday night's episode of Real Time with Bill Maher is when he talked about it. Maher discussed the issue with New York Times columnist Frank Bruni and Newsweek Batya Angar Sargan columnist, and Maher pointed to the fact that the bill does not actually say banning gay or using the word gay at all, and clearly addresses only classroom instruction for children. Now, this is in spite of the fact that everything that you've heard, I'm sure, certainly in the mainstream media, was about the fact that the Florida Republicans were trying to ban certain words from speech. And it's like, no, not at all. The Florida people, the representatives in Florida and the governor just didn't want the teachers having this kind of discussion with children. So kind of like obvious, right? Common sense, like where we used to be maybe just 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And the fact that here we are in 2022 and we actually have to have this conversation at all. We have to actually pass legislation. Since when do we need to even pass legislation to stop this from happening? What it means that it's happening. And this kind of legislation should be passed in every state legislature. So here is Batya Ungar-Sargon. She's a columnist at Newsweek, obviously a pretty daggone liberal, needless to say, hack of a magazine. And she's discussing this with Maher in his little panel about House Bill 1557. We have that clip. And here it is.
One that I read right before the show was that the vast majority of the bill is about parents' right to know if their child is identifying, changing the way that they're, presenting, if the teacher's calling them by a different name, this kind of thing.
I think in California, the school has more of those rights than the parent.
Well, that's not right.
That's right. Okay, great.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's not how everybody feels out here. It's like we need to protect the student from the parents with the school. The school and
yeah, that's a political winner. Yeah.
Right. Well, oh, you should live out here for a while. You'll see some crazy shit. Okay.
And Maher's like, yeah, if you lived out in California, you'd see some crazy stuff happening out here, and anything is possible. Well, anything is possible, obviously, in all of these blue states. This is happening in Maryland. It's happening in New York State. It's happening in Jersey. It's happening in California. It's happening in Illinois, just to name a few. By it, I'm talking about inappropriate school instruction, pre-K through third grade, about trans indoctrination. And by the way, any kind of sexual conversation. A teacher talking to your children like little tiny kids and discussing these things with your kids and thinking that's appropriate. In normal times, we would actually have that teacher charged and potentially fired. But this is how far the left has gone. It has infiltrated every aspect of public education. And so Florida Governor DeSantis, we played this clip previously at the last podcast, I believe. DeSantis was questioned about House Bill 1557. So you just heard Bill Maher having this reasonable discussion about why this bill makes sense and does nothing like what the media said it was trying to do. Here is the media trying to call the bill the, quote, "Don't Say Gay" Florida bill. And they say this to, of all people, Governor DeSantis, who just torches them. We have that clip. And here it is.
Article 7, parental rights in education, what critics call the Don't Say Gay bill, is on the Senate floor.
Does it say that in the bill?
I know that you support.
Does it say that in the bill?
I'm
asking you to tell me what's in the bill, because you are pushing false narratives. It doesn't matter what critics say.
Hold on. It says it bans classroom instruction on sexual identity and gender orientation.
For who?
For
grades pre-K through 3. So 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds. And the idea that you wouldn't be honest about that and tell people what it actually says, it's why people don't trust people like you, because you peddle false narratives. And so we disabuse you of those narratives. And we're going to make sure that parents are able to send their kid to kindergarten without having some of this stuff injected into their school curriculum.
Amen to that. Amen to that. And finally, you have Bill Maher, of course, talking about DeSantis in a way, and the Republicans in Florida about House Bill 1557, and saying, you know what, this is kind of a reasonable bill. I mean, why would we be talking about kids anyway about the subject matter? I mean, really? I mean, when did this happen? And so if you think that is enough, folks, and that we need to pass this bill across the nation, state by state, I think it's a brilliant idea, by the way. Well, here is another example of what is really happening across America with respect to your children and how the left is trying to groom your children into their very sick trans ideology, among other things, and to sexualize and groom your children just in general, which, by the way, is illegal. So in the Gateway Pundit, disturbing, leftist activists organizes, quote, sex ed summer camps for 8 to 10-year-old children in Indiana. You'll love this. Not, of course. A leftist activist in Indianapolis, Indiana, is hosting a sex ed summer camp that will teach 8 to 10-year-old children about woke sex ideology, transgender theory, and how to use condoms, among other disturbing things. These are 8 to 10-year-olds. The camp, right, it's a summer camp, which is being organized by self-proclaimed children's sexuality educator Ashley Robertson, is being advertised for children in grades 3 to 5 who can be as young as 7 years old. In other words, way too young for some adult who's not their parent to discuss this matter with them. Major hat tip to Choice Media executive director Tony Kinnett, who exposed Robertson's event in a long tweet thread. So this story was broken. It's a real story, ladies and gentlemen. This is a real camp. It is a real camp for 8 to 10-year-old children. And it's run by radical, crazy leftists who are trying to groom your children to be sexually active in elementary school. As is always the case with radical leftists, they are playing a game of hide the ball when it comes to their insane agenda. In this case, Robertson, who put this camp together, weaves benign-sounding topics into the itinerary to mask the true perverted nature of sexualizing third graders. However, things get even more disturbing when realizing how radical Robertson and her views truly are. According to her bio on Multi-Amory, a leftist progressive podcast, never heard that one before, Multi-Amory, a leftist progressive podcast. Robertson is a self-proclaimed expert on age-appropriate education about sex and consent for children, who identifies as a feminine, bi-curious, ethically polyamorous. What is polyamorous? Sexual submissive. So I gotta read that again. I'm sorry, podcast listeners. According to her bio on Multi-Amory, which is a leftist progressive podcast, Robertson is a self-proclaimed expert on age-appropriate education about sex and consent for children, who identifies as a feminine, bi-curious, ethically polyamorous, sexual submissive. And ladies and gentlemen, do you really want that person teaching your kid at a sex ed camp when your kid is in 3rd grade? You know, I'm not sure, or 4th grade, or 5th grade, or 6th grade. Not only that, this so-called children's specialist also over a decade of experience in the BDSM scene and isn't shy of perverse topics to boot. So we got our millennial here who's laughing like crazy behind the camera. So Chris, what does BDSM stand for? The acronym?
I don't know.
You must know. Anyway, in a podcast appearance on Multi-Amory, Robertson discussed topics like introducing pornography to kids, polyamorous relationships, which I guess means non-monogamy, teaching kids to talk to people outside their family, in other words, strangers, and how to discuss kink. She even torched on how to discuss these topics with children who have special needs. Disgusting, podcast listeners. You found it? What is it? BDSM?
This is bondage.
Bondage. Okay, so there you go, podcast listeners. This genius wants your kid to go to a camp, and they're hiding what the camp is about for your elementary school age children to teach you about bondage, among other things. Can you believe this? I mean, this stuff is real. What do you have?
Bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism.
Bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism. Yeah, for your elementary school kid. And so you have Here's what I often get, podcast listeners. Okay. I often hear this from people out there in podcast land and elsewhere. When we post about this on the Mark and the Millennials media and so forth, media outlets, people say, oh, it's not true that any of this is happening in elementary school. Children are not being taught these things in elementary school. It's just wrong. You're lying. You're not telling the truth. Folks, not only is it happening, but now we see that there are sex ed camps. And there are some teachers, some, emphasis on some, who are all in on this ideology, this sick, illegal ideology, by the way, who are leading children and parents to these sex ed camps. And we know this is happening. So for those of you out there who say, oh, it's just not possible, you are just trying to stretch the truth to try to get listeners or whatever. Folks, it is so happening right now in American public education. And sometimes it's happening with the full support of the administration, meaning the principals and vice principals and the superintendent of the public school system. And other times, to be fair, it's just a rogue teacher that's doing it. We don't know in any particular situation who's encouraging this, and other than the fact that we have to start investigating it and then pass bills like House Bill 1557, like they did in Florida. And that is Bill Maher. Bill Maher agrees with DeSantis.